Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to SHOEphoria, the footwear podcast where myths are made and busted. Hi, I'm your host, Simon Bartold. Thank you so much for joining me. Please check us out on all of your normal favorite social media platforms. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, Facebook. Of course, we also have our own YouTube channel. You can check out lots of great stuff there relating to footwear. And please visit our website, www.bartoldclinical.com. A ton of open access stuff there as well. Righto, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of this particular podcast. I've got a special treat for you as always, but this one is particularly special because I'm talking to the man who needs no introduction, and that should be the end of it really, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. This is my old friend, a man I've lectured with all over the world. His name is Dr. Kevin Kirby, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to grill him about some of his thoughts on footwear and the footwear industry generally. I started off the interview talking to him that I had a sense of disquiet from Kevin in relation to the running footwear industry in particular over the last year or so, and I did put the question to him, was he disillusioned? I think you'll find his response quite interesting here. Kevin's always been a man who's never been afraid to give an opinion, and that's one of the reasons that he's regarded as such a legend in the professions of podiatry and biomechanics. So he was quite happy to espouse his likes and dislikes, both now and in recent years, and give us some ideas on what he thinks is going to be important in the future. One of his big beefs is the issue of durability in running footwear, and he came up with a very, very interesting suggestion that may be of benefit to not only us as practitioners, but also to the broader manufacturing community. So have a listen out for that. It would have been impossible to have a discussion without talking a little bit about the super shoes with Kevin. I didn't want to labour that point because we've talked about it a lot, but he did have some interesting thoughts on the biomechanics of the super shoes that you can hear. We also talked about how Kevin actually utilises footwear as part of his treatment protocols, so actually using the shoe as a part of his quiver of tools to use to treat different conditions. And I think you'll find that very, very interesting. We talked a bit about the comfort filter made famous by Ben O'Nig, and something I've written about quite recently, and just had a discussion about whether he felt that really was valid or whether it was still quite theoretical. Now, we rounded the discussion off by leaving running footwear altogether and talking about what my European and English colleagues would call football, but what we here in Australia and also in the USA call soccer. And in particular, we wanted to talk about soccer footwear. And I posed the question, well, Kevin, how come it hasn't changed at all in the last 40-odd years? And are we seeing issues related to that? All right, so we'll dive in now with Dr. Kevin Kirby and this episode of SHOEphoria. I'm your host, Simon Bartold. I hope you enjoy it. Let's now have a listen to what Kevin Kirby has to say about the wide, wonderful world of athletic footwear.
You're listening to the SHOEphoria podcast by Bartold Clinical. Listen in as we delve deep into the world of evidence-based sports science, sports medicine, and athletic footwear science. Let's go and bust some myths.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of SHOEphoria, the podcast where footwear myths are made and broken. And I'm delighted to have with me, it's a cliche saying someone needs no introduction, but this man really does need no introduction. His name is Dr. Kevin Kirby. I'm very happy to say he is an old friend of mine. He is the temperamental lead singer of our boy band, the Tarsal Coalition, who are temporarily in recession due to artistic differences. But we're not here to talk about music, although we could, because Kevin is a real music buff. We're here to talk about footwear and other things. Kevin, welcome to this episode of SHOEphoria. Thank you so much for joining us from beautiful Sacramento in California. How are you going?
Doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you again and hear you, and looking forward to the time we can lecture together again like we've done so many times before.
Yes, I know it's strange times, but it looks like we're finally sort of emerging from the darkness with a bit of luck. So hopefully 2022 will be the time that we'll see each other again, which will be great. Now, Kevin, I've got a whole lot of different things I wanted to ask you, but look, it would be fair to say that
as much as anybody in our profession, you have contributed many, many things. And we're going to talk predominantly about footwear, but I'll put you on the spot here. And one of the questions that I have for you is I'm just wondering, of all the things you've achieved, so I can think of things like the Kirby wedge and the rotational equilibrium paradigm, of all the things that you've done in the world of podiatry, what's the thing that stands out for you as being the most satisfying?
Well, I think, the papers, a few of the papers I've done, the subtalar joint axis and rotational equilibrium theory of foot function, published in JATMA, the medial heel skive paper, and also the more recent paper on the longitudinal arch load sharing system. And those theoretical papers I'm very proud of, because I think we're trying to carve new ideas into the profession that hopefully will last and help people understand how the foot and lower extremity functions. The 5 books I've done with the Precision Intercast that have been all translated into Spanish are big accomplishments, I think, and just trying to spread the knowledge, foot and lower extremity biomechanics, orthotic function, sports injuries, shoe function, to a wider audience, so that we're using the basics of biomechanics and physics, so that we have a more clear understanding of what's actually going on in the foot mechanically when we see our patients who have mechanically related disorders of the foot and lower extremity.
Yeah, well, I did ask you for one, but you've rolled off a list there. So I'm glad you did that, because I think that, you've had so much influence on so many people within our profession, and also in other professions like physiotherapy and even biomechanics. And you're one of the few who's managed to break out of the very structured paradigms within podiatric biomechanics, I guess, and also, I guess, make people question some of those paradigms, and you've certainly been at the forefront of that. So you've had a great role as an educator, I think, and that continues and will continue, and the profession's grateful to you for that. Now, we're here to talk about footwear, and I wanted to, I guess, lead into that by, I guess, saying that talking to you a little bit over the last couple of months, I get a sense that maybe Kevin Kirby's slightly disillusioned with where we are with footwear right now, and maybe there's a few things that you're not entirely happy about with the direction it's taking. Would that be a fair comment, or is that not the case?
I don't think that I'm dissatisfied with everything. I am dissatisfied with certain aspects of what's happening in, say, specifically the running shoe industry. I think that what I am happy to see happening, and ever since, from 10, 11 years ago when the minimalist shoes came out and Hoka came out, and 2 opposite directions, one minimalist and one maximalist, and seeing the diversity of shoes now available to the runner, I think is a very positive thing, because we have a much better selection of shoes for the people who are running, and we have different options, much more than we had, just say, 15 years ago, as you very well know. I think the negatives I have are seeing the expense of the shoes, and pretty much in California now, it's hard to get a running shoe for under $100, whereas before, 15 years ago, we had shoes that were, most of them were under $100. And then also the longevity of shoes. And this is, one of my favorite shoes that I do recommend a lot, are the Hoka One shoes. They just are not very durable. So I think as long as the buyer is aware that these shoes are not going to last as long because the midsole's collapsing out faster, I have no problem with that. But I have many patients who come in and they spend $130, $140 US dollars on a shoe, and then 2 or 3 months later, they're having to buy a new one. So that being said, that would be really the biggest negative, I think, that I have in the running shoe industry currently.
Yeah, it's interesting, when I put my design innovation hat on as being somebody who's sort of involved in the actual, I guess, development process, it's always a prickly issue for us, so we want to build a shoe that's as technical as possible, and we want to build a shoe that offers performance and protection, and sometimes that is at the expense of durability, and it's a juggling act. It's quite difficult to balance all that. And as the materials change, we're continually searching for different midsole materials and different foams. We're being drowned in different foams from all the different companies, but a lot of these foams are not particularly durable. Look, I would have to. It would be remiss of me not to get a comment from you on your thoughts on the direction of the super high performance shoes and your feelings on those. I know we've discussed this in the past, but what's your thought on the so-called super shoes? And I'm not just, we shouldn't just single out Nike here, because now we've got, I think there are somewhere near 15 different companies who are in that club now. What are your thoughts on all of that, Kevin?
Well, I think it's a fascinating, from a pure biomechanics standpoint, that Nike could have designed a shoe that actually did increase performance so much far and above what other shoes were at the time they came out with the Nike 4% and the next and the other iterations of the Nike Super Shoe. Yeah, I think it's fascinating just reading the papers and trying to understand, is it the foam or is it the carbon plate that's giving the increase in running economy to these runners? Again, durability is an issue, but I think the bigger question is how much innovation are we going to allow in shoes to allow these shoes to improve performance, which then breaks records, and are we really comparing equivalent performances, looking at a runner from 15 years ago to now, saying, okay, he ran a 2:05 marathon and he beat this other guy that ran a 2:07 marathon, but his shoe is better. And so I think the biggest worry I have is that, and I think the biggest worry I have is that it's hard to compare performances of 10 or 15 years ago to now because of the super shoes. So I think that's my biggest concern. But I mean, if we accept it as a fact that these shoes are improving performance, which I'm sure they are, then it's not too much of a problem. But I do think that the rule change where they're limiting the thickness of the midsole, I think was a step in the right direction, just done a little bit too late, I think.
Yeah, we're in extraordinary times, really. I know I read a lot prior to the Tokyo Olympics, particularly some comments from Usain Bolt, where he was very concerned in his events, so obviously the 100, 200, 400 meter relay, he was very concerned that his world record was going to be beaten by somebody in a shoe that offered technical advantages that he wasn't privy to. And I guess my thoughts on that would be, well, technology is technology, and it does increase. But we've got this situation now where one company, Nike, in distance running, owns every world record from 5,000 meters to the marathon, with the exception of the half marathon world record in men's and women's. Completely unprecedented. They won 10 times the number of gold medals in Tokyo than in running events, including things like steeplechase, than any other company. It's a fairly big bias, isn't it?
Well, I think the Nike, I have to give Nike a lot of credit. I mean, really, when you look at running shoes over the past 15 years, I'd say Hoka One was a real trendsetter in getting the first Maxim shoe, and then Nike with their next 4% and next percent shoe was really those two shoes, I think, and both very thick midsole shoes really have changed the running shoe industry and the way we view shoes and what they can do and what they can provide for the runner.
Yeah, so that's a good point. What I want you to do now is put your clinician's hat on, and I guess the question I'd have for you is twofold. So, in relation to the so-called super shoes, do you see a downside in terms of potential for injury? And also with footwear generally, how important is footwear for treating specific conditions? So we think about, I guess we could think of all sorts of different things like problems around the first metatarsophalangeal joint. We could think about even things like shin pain or anterior knee pain. So part one of the question is there a downside to the super shoes? Part two of the question is, how does Kevin Kirby go about using footwear as part of his quiver of treatments for athletic injury?
Well, in regards to the super shoes, I don't see that there's too much of a downside as long as the runners know what they're getting into, that this is not a shoe that's going to be durable, that is used mostly for racing or maybe fast workouts. And I don't see a lot of patients are actually using these shoes unless they're, at the top level of the races. Obviously, I'm seeing patients only that are injured, so most of these people are not elite runners. They're just the average everyday runner who's trying to do their first marathon or runs maybe 20 or 30 miles a week at most. So I really don't have a problem with the super shoes as far as I don't see a lot of injuries from them because not a lot of my patients are wearing them. But in that instance, as far as when we start talking about actually treating runners with shoes, I've been doing that for the 36 years I've been in practice. And obviously that's one of the things I said earlier was about the options we have now. I mean, I may recommend a minimalist shoe for someone with anterior knee pain, or like an ultra shoe that has a 0 heel drop for anterior knee pain. I may recommend a Hoka bandied shoe for the runner that has first MPJ, let's say hallux limitus or hallux ridus, since it has a stiff shank or at the metatarsophalangeal joint. Yeah, I try to basically look at shoes. I have a shoe list, and when I am treating patients, I'll circle a shoe and say, why don't you go into the local running shoe store, try these shoes out and see which one feels best, and go ahead and get that one. But I do kind of steer away from just saying go get any shoe, but I don't specifically say get this shoe unless it's something very specific.
So I wrote an article very recently for Bartold Clinical that was discussing Benno Nigg's comfort filter, and I was actually putting it under the microscope based on a new paper which really questioned the validity of the comfort filter. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, the comfort filter, certainly in some retail and also with some of our colleagues, has sort of been cast in stone as being all you need is a comfortable shoe and you won't get injured and, you'll perform properly. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how realistic is that?
Well, I think there's problems with it. And I think the last time we spoke together with Benno back in Manchester, I actually spoke with him about this, that I didn't think that that just what you get in the running shoe store as being the most comfortable may be the best shoe for you, because there's many other factors in what initially it feels like inside the store. And I think that's why shoe manufacturers are making more cushioned shoes, because they feel good in the store when you're running on them. But at the same time, if the shoe is breaking down more quickly and being rotated into varus or valgus due to the shoe wear, that could cause injury, even though that shoe may have been the most comfortable one. So I think it needs to be, I do believe, though, that going with comfort initially is a good way to start people choosing running shoes. But it may take some trial and error to find really the best shoe, because many people who find a running shoe to be comfortable initially in the running shoe store and they purchase it find out this wasn't the right shoe for them because it causes certain injuries or may lead to increased risk of injuries as they, get maybe a month or 2 or 3 months of running into those shoes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that, historically, I think one of the issues we've had, and everybody always trots out the numbers and says, the last 40 years, injury rates haven't changed with running. There are a number of reasons for that, and not just footwear, because of course in the last 40 years footwear's changed a lot. But I do think that probably it's not a case of whether the shoe is comfortable or not. It might well be a case of whether the shoe is uncomfortable or not. So I think a lot of people probably go in, they have the shoe, they have their gait analysis, retail works to a fit to vertical model. In other words, bring the foot back to vertical, which I don't agree with, and we might get your opinion on that in a minute. And they walk out with a shoe that generally wasn't that comfortable for them, and then it probably won't perform for them. So I sort of think that maybe that's the missing link here. It's not so much of the comfort filter, is the shoe actually properly matching to the foot. And as we move on, we're going to see a lot more of this with the ascent of things like anatomical lasting, where you have full contouring and full pressure on the plantar surface of the foot. These things are all available right now, but you and I have discussed motion control a lot over the years, and I don't actually want to belabor this because I want to get into other things, but we've sort of agreed to just disagree on that a bit over the years. But what are your thoughts on this whole fit to vertical model of footwear and, the whole concept of motion control? Do you still think that's super important, or do you think we might have better ways of dealing with that these days?
Well, I think the problem with the motion control is that you're trying to, it's the shoe. We definitely see, for example, the heavier runners, the people who are very pronated feet, doing better in the more stable shoes. Shoes that don't have a low durometer midsole, a thick midsole. And it also depends so much on if they're wearing some sort of over-the-counter orthosis or custom orthosis in their shoe and what kind of shoe they should be running in. So there's so many factors. I don't like the running shoe stores putting them into a motion control shoe just because they see them pronate. You can have pronations normal. So I don't think that the running shoe salespeople have enough knowledge to really say, well, this is going to be your best shoe because your feet pronate so many degrees, et cetera. So then that's one of the things I like about the comfort filter is that, hey, put them in a comfortable shoe. Then, if you're having a problem, come and see me. I can, get you an over-the-counter insert, adjust it, or make you a custom orthosis if you have some problems. But I think it's very complex what we're doing. The human body is so complex. We have multiple factors that we have to consider, not just the structure of the foot, but also what type of running are they doing, how many miles a week, what kind of terrain they're running on, the body weight. I oftentimes think the body weight has a huge factor on how a shoe performs. And, I'm seeing people from anywhere from 100 pounds or less if they're high school girl runners to people who are running who are well over 250 pounds. And, you can't get the same shoe for those runners, even though they have the same foot shape. So it is multifactorial, these injuries and how we pick shoes, and that should be taken into consideration. I just don't know if the running shoe salesperson, the typical running shoe salesperson has enough knowledge, even with the best gimmicks they have in the store, in order to produce the best shoe fit and best function for the runner.
Yeah, so completely agree that I think that, obviously running is all about individualization, really, and that there is great variability from runner to runner. I read a really interesting paper yesterday from Canadian physiotherapist SHOEphoria, and they were looking at risk factors for running-related injury. And they were referencing the famous Van Gent paper from 2007. And basically they said, nothing's changed. We still don't know what causes running-related injury because there are so many variables. How can we possibly drill down on it? So, look, I want to move on to something different now because we talk a lot about running, but I want to talk about football. Now, your grandson is a very good soccer player. He's a big lad for, 14 or something like that, Kevin?
He's 15 and 6'2".
6'2", okay. Well, that's unusual for a soccer player for a start, isn't it? So,
he's bright red hair too. He stands out like a.
He should get the refs' votes for the MVP then. If he's 6'2" with bright red hair, he's certainly going to. If he has a good game, they're not going to miss him for sure. Now, I'm going to get on my particular hobby horse here, and that is I'm going to get on to the topic of soccer boots, which I hate with a passion because I think they're so primitive, and I think that of all footwear, they're probably the only one that I would finger as saying, I think there's a direct relationship between the footwear soccer players wear and injury, and we can't really say that about other footwear. I'd be very interested on your thoughts on what you see in soccer footwear and what you think should change, if anything.
Well, the basic soccer shoe design is kind of like the basic running shoe design in the sense that there's so much tradition that goes into that. I think there hasn't been a lot of new innovations that I've seen that haven't already been tried before. There's different cleat patterns. The uppers have changed. I do see quite a few youth and a few adult soccer players. And the shoes, I think, have some bearing. I've seen a few patients that have had problems, let's say, with pain underneath the fifth metatarsal head because the particular soccer cleat is right underneath that fifth metatarsal head and they're playing on a hard surface. So we grind down that one little cleat underneath the fifth metatarsal, for example. But in general, I don't see that the soccer shoes are as much of a cause of injury for soccer players as our running shoes are for the runners. So I think that since soccer is a side-to-side sport and there's a lot of other potential causes for injury, that most of the top soccer boot manufacturers all have reasonable designs that And if the soccer player is able to go into a store and try on the one that is comfortable and fits well and feels good on the ground when they're running and doing side-to-side movements, and then I think that that's probably okay for them to play in. Of course, sometimes you don't learn it's bad for you till you get out on the soccer pitch and actually go and play a few games in it. But I really think that the soccer boots are important, but I think maybe not so important as running shoes are for the runner.
So I'd throw a few red flags out here for you to comment on of my observations. And my first observation is that I could very easily get on the internet and call up a photograph of, let's say, an Umbro boot from 1984, and I could compare it to, say, an Adidas, or pick any brand you like, Adidas boot from 2021, and I doubt you'd be able to pick which year they came from. If I did the same with a running shoe, and I picked a shoe from 1984 compared to 2021, you'd have no difficulty picking the difference. Same with a basketball boot, same with a tennis shoe. My perspective is that there's been no technological advantage. And more importantly, when you get up to the elite level, and maybe even your grandson, the elites, certainly, sort of Premier League level, those guys are running between 9 and 13 kilometres a game, so upwards of 10 miles, or close to 10 miles a game. They are changing direction, but they're doing this in a boot with no meaningful midsole. They're doing it in a boot with no protection whatsoever. And I just can't get beyond the fact that I don't think that's correct. I don't think they should be doing that. And the other thing that happens here is that, and we've seen this 2019 and a part of 2020, is that we saw a rash of English Premier League players getting fractures of midshaft fractures of the fifth metatarsals. And that was primarily from one boot, which had far too much flexibility through the midfoot, and they were drifting laterally in the shoe, and the cleat was acting as a cleaver on the midshaft of the fifth metatarsal. Now, those boots had to be retrofitted with a carbon fibre plate to avoid that problem. I'm not aware of any other sport where you have those sorts of problems.
Soccer is definitely a unique sport in many ways. The football in other countries, of course. Yeah, I see problems with certain boots. I've had the patients in with they come in with a soccer injury to their foot, and always make sure they bring their shoes into them. And many times I have them, the solution is to change shoes. Either I can modify shoes to some extent, you can add carbon plates, but many times, I'm not seeing professionals, so they're not locked into one brand like some professionals are. So, and I do agree with you, there has been very little change in soccer boots, but, one could say, well, maybe that's because the soccer boot has kind of reached its pinnacle, and there's not much you can, how much variation. You can't really lift the midsole up, make it thick, then you become laterally unstable on your side-to-side movements. You can't add too much cushion to it, because if you do...
No, I'm going to stop you there. Why do you say that? Why would it be any different than basketball, where we have obviously a very meaningful midsole and a very meaningful lift? You couldn't get a more side-to-side sport than basketball, but we don't see that occurring in basketball. So why do you necessarily think that would happen in soccer?
Well, I think basketball is different. And number one, you're playing on a hard, flat surface, and your shoe bottom, your shoe sole is flat and without cleats. So you have a more stable surface. So I think you can get by with some midsole. Basketball, obviously, you wouldn't want to...
I'm going to interrupt you again here, because this is an important point. Okay, let's forget basketball. Let's talk about field hockey and lacrosse, which are both played at a non-elite level. They're both played on grass.
Yeah, well, I don't see many... there's not much field hockey here in California.
No.
I think, and lacrosse is, I don't see... I'm not familiar with those shoes.
You don't see injuries in those players because they wear correct footwear for the sport. There you go. That's my theory, that I just think footy boots are absolutely derelict. But look, it is interesting. It is a particular interest of mine, because I've been very involved in Australian football for a long, long time, and just have observed over a period of many years that many of the injuries we see are related to the footwear, and I just don't see that in other sports, and it concerns me that we don't see change.
Well, let me ask you a question. How thick of a midsole do you think you could put into, let's say, any side-to-side turf sport such as Australian football or soccer, and still not cause problems with instability, where you're lifting basically the axis of the subtalar joint further away from the ground, so that when they do a side-to-side movement, they're going to rotate more and more risk of inversion sprains, eversion sprains, falling out of the shoe and making the shoe heavier at the same time. So I think that's the reason that, I mean, do you think you could have a Hoka style midsole on a soccer boot and not have the patients have a real problem with it?
Oh, no, not at all. Of course, you can't do that. But we know back in the day when I was involved with ASICS internationally, we designed football boots way back in 1999, and those boots remain pivotal in their range in 2021. And those boots have a 10 millimeter raise, but the raise is 10 millimeters in the heel to 0 millimeters in the forefoot. So, the amount of lift off the support surface is probably not measurable. You wouldn't be able to measure a change in, I think, the joint moments. But what we do know is that makes a huge difference to a number of different things. So we published a study that looked at load on the hamstrings particularly, because in Australian football, hamstring injuries is probably the most catastrophic injury, and it leads to all sorts. There's knock-on effect, and 50% of all people who have hamstring injuries will get re-injured. So we were able to show with fine wire EMG that just by putting a 10 mil raise in, you could reduce the strain in the hamstrings. So it works. We know it works. So there's no reason to not do it. Basically, there's no real downside to it, and certainly no evidence whatsoever that it would increase the incidence of inversion ankle injury. But going to something like a Hoka, where you've got massive stacks of, 36 and 32, and that's never going to work for soccer or any other multi-directional sport, obviously. But
that may be why. What I'm going back to your original question. That's probably why we're not seeing so much variation in the soccer boots, because there's only so much. Running shoes, since it's a straight ahead sport, distance running, you don't have to worry about the side to side stability so much. I mean, look at the Nike, the Nike 4%. That's a huge stack on that shoe with a carbon plate. I mean, you try to play tennis in that shoe and you'll fall off the shoe. So I think that the soccer boot has fewer design variables in it compared to running shoes, like you said, from, let's say, a running shoe from 1995 to now. Big difference, but soccer boots kind of look the same, maybe because you can only do so much with the sole. I know I'm just throwing that out as a hypothesis, and I don't know that for sure, but that certainly seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would fall back on the field hockey example, which I do have some experience in. I mean, my friend and colleague at Bartold Clinical, Paul Griffin, and I were very involved in the design of a field hockey shoe that was used by the Belgian team in the Olympic Games just recently. And that sport is very similar to football in terms of the multi-directional, that very, very rapid acceleration, deceleration, side-to-side movements. And that has a full midsole on that shoe. And that's the way field hockey shoes are built. But I've looked at the injury rates in field hockey, and they don't have any more inversion injury than any other sport. So you can do it. My point would be that I think that the design of football boots is not driven by designers and developers. It's driven by the players and what they think they need. And you and I both know the players don't know what they need.
I think the players, just like runners who are experienced players know what feels good on their feet. And I think that's the bottom line. Now, when you come down to injuries, there's so many factors that go into any injuries, whether you're on the soccer pitch or running a marathon, that it's not just the shoe. And, maybe we place too much emphasis on the shoe as the culprit of these running injuries or soccer injuries, but certainly someone like you who's been involved with, running shoe and other athletic shoe design, it's something very important. But at the same time, when we look at the overall performance of these players, whether they're on the soccer pitch or in a road race or on the track, the shoe is just one factor of doing the sport effectively, and something obviously we're both interested in. But I try to, when I'm seeing patients who have running injuries or injuries in other sports, it's not just looking at the shoe. We're looking at how they train, how are they training, how are they, was it something that they changed, they're running on a different surface, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously shoes are important, but I think that we have to, as clinicians especially, not so much in your line of work, being more shoe development, but as a clinician, from my aspect, I have to look at the whole individual, how they're training, what shoe are they running in, have they decided to change their diet even? So these are all factors that may come into running injuries.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I completely agree that it's a lot more complex than it looks. We factor in even things like the amount of sleep you get, and certainly genetics, I think, is going to be a big upcoming thing. We know there's certain genes involved in certain injuries. So, all right. Well, I promised I wouldn't keep you too long, so we might wrap it up. I'm going to ask you one last question, and you may or may not have an answer for this, and that is there one thing in footwear that you really would like to see changed at any level in any sport, at running or any sport really? Is there one thing that you feel really is lacking that we're not doing at the moment?
Specifically for the running shoe industry, I really think that it would help not only the specialty shoe store, but also the runners who are purchasing these shoes to have some sort of a durability index. It wouldn't have to be something real sophisticated, but so that the purchaser of these shoes that are ranging anywhere from $110 to maybe close to $200 know that these shoes may not last as long. Because I do have a lot of patients who purchase these running shoes and are disgruntled that they spent so much money and the shoe only lasted 2 months. I think that would be something that I would think would be fairly easy to have, like, these are the most durable, these are the least durable, so that the running shoe consumer is aware of going into the running shoe store that these shoes may need to be replaced more often.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I wonder from the manufacturer's perspective how practical that is. So, I think if they developed a durability index and said, well, this shoe is going to be good for, let's say, 500 miles and it wore out after 300 miles, I think that might create some problems for the manufacturer. And that is maybe why this hasn't happened. But you know what? I'm actually going to follow that up and have a bit of a think about that, because I do think that's quite a good idea. Alrighty, well, we might wrap it up there, Kevin. I think that's a good point to end it on. Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin Kirby, for joining us today on SHOEphoria. Really appreciate your thoughts and your experience, and I hope people have enjoyed it. I'm sure they will have, and there are, as always, a few little pearls in there, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Simon.
Thanks for joining us for the SHOEphoria podcast by Bartold Clinical. Join us next time.